right, folks, we've made it to our third and final lecture in our series. Thanks so much for joining us again. If you haven't joined us for the first two, I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Peter Murata, and I am joined tonight by Michael Achille or I should say rather, he's joined by me. In the truest sense, we've been so honored to have been working with the library and to be hosted by the library for the past few weeks. Just a couple of notes before we begin. Tonight is the last night to take in the display that's out in the hallway. There will be a new display going up as of Saturday when the library opens doors again. And that also means it's the last evening. If you haven't already, please sign our guest book. Share some of your thoughts, especially if there's things that come up from the lecture tonight. We'd love to have that. I know that the library is eager to keep a copy of the record and to remember this 50th year, the 50th anniversary of World's End as a real bright spot. So with all that being said, I'm actually going to turn it over to Michael, who will be doing most of the leading tonight. I'm happy to say that after spending about an hour and 15 minutes in a monologue, our first lecture, and then struggling through with Ryland in our second lecture. I say that kiddingly because he's here tonight. But I'm very happy to be joined by Michael tonight. And with that being said, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Peter. So thank you, everyone, again, as Peter said, for coming out. We're going to be using this wonderful footage, 1929 Brewer family films that was recently rediscovered here at the Hingham Library. We're going to try and tell the story of agriculture on World's End, the Brewer family in general, and their legacy in Hingham. It's a story first and foremost about preservation and civic pride. I want to give a shout out to HCAM, definitely, and a huge thank you who've come here to film all three of our lectures. To that point, since they're being filmed, these really are acting as sort of oral histories. So again, Peter and I really want to encourage you guys to raise your hands and jump in with personal recollections, memories, anything in the film that kind of stirs something in you that makes you think of, oh wow, that reminds me of. Jump right in, raise your hand. We'd love to get it as part of the recording, most definitely. So again, as Peter said, this is the final lecture as we start to wrap up the story of World's End. Please, again, take part. Some questions to consider throughout the course of this talk informally. Why was and is land conservation so important? Where today can we see the impact of the Brewer family in town, by name and also in effect? And what are some contemporary examples of land conservation and preservation? So again, kind of bring the historical message we're trying to show here into the present day. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Peter here, just hoping he can talk about some of the farming that took place on the property during the time of John Brewer, and how that's reminiscent of what goes on there today.
Sure, yeah, and just to reiterate, like our first lecture was quite a long bit of just me talking, and then we had some questions at the end. The second one was a little looser, with Ryland and I having a conversation. This is the loosest. This is, please, join in the conversation as we're going through some of this. If a hand goes up, we're happy to take a moment and elaborate. So, please be a part of the discussion tonight. Okay. Farming at World's End is kind of the end-all be-all of what is land use on the property. I mean, obviously, we touched on it in the first lecture, the colonial era, where remnants of that can still be seen with some of the stone walls that are left over that served as property lines. The fact that the fields are still open the same way they have been for 400 years, that alone is characteristic of this colonial era farming. When Brewer came to the property, John Brewer, when he first came to Martin's Lane and started acquiring land, he had it in mind right from the onset to get going with a farm. Actually, before his house even started getting constructed, he had bought a handful of cows, he had bought a handful of sheep, some hens, a rooster. A farm was in the plans. It was going to be World's End Farm. But it wasn't farming in the traditional sense. So if the old hand Thaxter or old hand Barnes had been out there, they are working this land for sustenance, for a living, for this is their livelihood. Brewers approaching it from more of a nostalgia, okay? The Brewers are wealthy Boston businessmen. John Brewer himself was a lawyer. They're escaping the city, they're escaping the city heat, and they're coming to a town like Hingham in the summer to reminisce about the good old days and to hold on to something that's important, really kind of shaping a narrative of heritage. He's deciding to say, this idea of agriculture in a town like Hingham, what is important to me, and I'm going to cause that to persist by now developing my own farm and buying up this land and having it serve the purposes of agriculture, but not to sustain, but more as an appreciation, like I said, like a heritage.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, just to that point, again, this is more of a gentleman's farming. So these are, again, wealthy industrialists, businessmen. To Peter's point, John was a lawyer, coming back to their family's roots. And again, this sense of nostalgia, this sense of, my forebears did this to subsist, but I'm going back to it from a scientific perspective, from a natural beauty perspective, and all that's kind of fitting into what John Brewer is trying to do on World's End. A little bit of history before then. The Barnes family farmed World's End during the 18th century. And during this time, again, Hingham is an agrarian-based economy, so it's dotted with farms all over the landscape. Just to give you an idea, the farms of Samuel Dunbar and Joshua Hersey on Prospect Street, that would become Codman Farm in the 20th century. Also, I'll make a quick side note here that while this is footage of World's End, it's also family footage, so what you're seeing here is a parade down Main Street. So there'll be some interspersed non-World's End viewing material throughout this. But there was also Benjamin and Abiel Witten farmed the land west of Accord Pond. Hingham Center was being farmed by Josiah Levitt. That would become Crest Farm later on. And much of the 3rd Division, which is now Wampatuck State Park, was treeless farmland, which is, again, kind of difficult to imagine. But you get this sense that Hingham was largely sprawling farmland during the 18th century. John Brewer comes onto the scene in 1855 and purchases 10 acres of farmland from Caleb Bates. And that land was between Martin's Lane and Hingham Harbor. So this isn't yet World's End. That was the same year as the construction of Rockland Street. We'll start with the next video. Brewer began with a yoke of oxen, a cow and a calf, some hens and roosters, and commenced farming, essentially with very little. But again, this wasn't meant to be a sustainable venture in the sense of providing for your family. It was meant to be something which was meant to appreciate the science and beauty of it all. So the building and farming commenced between 1855 and 1864, when John's son Frank reported they had 116 sheep and 10 lambs. That was in 1864. And they were pastured in the area beyond the bar, which is Planters Hill.
So where they were pastured was what's called World's End proper. A couple of interesting notes, just little tidbits about the property. So he buys that original 10 acres, and on it there's the only structure that's on that farmland is a dilapidated barn. It's not long after they purchase it and they start figuring out what to do with their first chunk of land, which became originally 24 acres. He purchases the 10, pretty soon after purchases a few more. So that barn ends up by getting raised, and the lumber for it ends up by getting used then for this collection of sheep. So if you're familiar with World's End and you get out to World's End proper, the area beyond the bar, not only will you pass a cedar fence post that was used to fence off the bar to allow the sheep to be protected out there, but if you snuck into the woods a little bit on a path that sometimes gets maintained, you'll find the sheepfold. And the stone foundation is left, but the wood that would have been associated with the sheepfold actually came from the old barn as part of his original purchase on Martin's Lane.
Yeah, and during this time, sheep was actually the most popular animal to raise. It was one of the few agricultural stocks that was actually on the rise. Again, people were getting away from farming. We're seeing industrialization. We're seeing the growth of other industries, and people are getting away from this kind of subsistence farming. So between 1861 and 1865, the number of sheep being pastured in Hingham actually skyrockets from 598 to over 1,200. in only 4 years. At this time, Frank's inventory, this is Frank Brewer, who would have been John's son, also indicated that the farm on, not yet on World's End, but on Martin's Lane, had 14 head of cattle and 2 yokes of oxen. And 1 year later, in 1865, the herd had grown to 25, and they took on 25 pigs and over 100 fowl. So it's rapidly expanding. To Peter's point, the Brewer estate house wasn't actually finished until 1856, so they actually commenced the farming operation before they even built their homestead, or
That's right.
if you can call it a homestead. It's a pretty expansive house.
Right.
And then other buildings followed soon after that. So they built a bathhouse in 1857, a larger hen house in 1858, and a summer house in 1859. Later that same year, the greenhouse was completed. And in 1863, and just a reminder, this is all before they purchased World's End. This is all leading up to that. So this is all along Martin's Lane. In 1863, they constructed a house for raising guinea pigs, which were several times entered by the family into the annual agricultural and horticultural fair. The first landscape gardener was hired in 1859, William F. Walsh, who Frank Brewer's wife Caroline writes, was to wage war on the cedar trees. But again, all this was done with mindfulness at hand. I mean, they were, again, trying to be very in tune to what the property was in need of.
Yeah, and I think that it's, it can easily get overlooked, but you heard him say the first gardener was hired, right? John Brewer is not a farmer. He's a lawyer. They hire a gardener. They hire work hands to not only work with the cattle, to work with the herd, so they hire herdsmen. They hire experts in animal husbandry. So there was people who were hired just to work with the horses. There were people who were hired to tend to the land in a gardening fashion. So not only did the amount of animals start growing, but the amount of people who lived on the Brewer estate was starting to grow. I believe they built some guest houses as well. Well, guest houses, but homes for the folks who worked on the land. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, most definitely. So we finally get to 1864, and Brewer purchases most of World's End from Norton Quincy Thaxter and Solomon Lincoln. By 1882, Brewer also had purchased Sarah and Langley Islands.
That's right, yeah.
Pretty much for the sole purpose of preserving his view. He wanted to make sure that no one else picked them up and started to construct houses on them. He liked the natural view of the harbor and wanted to make sure that was preserved. So again, that's kind of feeding into this idea of preservation, that Brewer wants to see this natural landscape preserved as it is. For the most part, he's not above building himself a palatial estate, but at the same time, he wants to make sure that that things are preserved. So by 1882, again, he owns now most of what's World's End as well as the 2 islands, with the exception of 2 lots. The Barnes lot, and as I had mentioned before, the Barnes family actually owned the property and farmed it extensively in the 18th century, and then also the Loud lot. So the Barnes lot, I guess, would be later added, but not until 1920. So this is
right.
Some time after Brewer acquires the rest of World's End. After the acquisition in 1864, John, and particularly his son Frank, continue the improvements that John had kind of set out to work on. And Frank takes a particular interest in trees and begins to rapidly plant trees all over the property, starting with 30 oak trees and eventually moving on to maples, lindens, and also chestnuts. Can you talk a little bit about that, Peter?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about a few things there. First of all, this idea that John Brewer went on this land acquisition campaign, but he wasn't able to get all the property, at least not while he was alive. So let's just focus, on the Barnes lot. The Loud lot is fairly self-explanatory, just for the record. If you drive into World's End and you head into the final parking lot, you are on the edge of the Loud lot. Historically, the Loud lot actually would have covered more acreage into what is now the World's End neighborhood. So basically the Cedar Gables section of the neighborhood, if you're familiar with that term, through Surrey Road and Croydon Road. And there's an old wall line actually that stretches from Martin's Lane all the way out to the Ware River. That would have been more or less the edge of the Loud lot. But the Barnes lot is of more interest because that's out at on World's End. It encompasses most of the, let's see if I can get my compass calibrated here. eastern, I'd say southeastern slope of Planters Hill. Okay, and it's significant that he didn't sell out to Brewer. The land out there was owned by many different people, and as they're divesting their interests of it, John Brewer acquires it. He then starts using the land for his own purposes, and a lot of times what happened was, say if he was to when he started building his roads, or when he built his new causeway that crossed over Damned Meadow, he was taking up old stone walls and using them for construction purposes. The fact that Barnes never sold out means that all of his old walls are intact. So when you walk through World's End now, and the first wall you see off to the left as you come up over Pine Hill, and the wall that you walk along parallel with as you walk up Planters Hill, those are Barnes walls, and they're left because Brewer couldn't do anything with them while he was constructing. Perhaps he would have left them either way, but they really speak to the heritage of the property and what was or what would have been colonial era property lines. So.
And then to move on, we're going to kind of bring this into a broader context here. So we've got these gentleman farmers coming back in the mid-19th century. The Civil War is starting, and young men are going off to fight. And much of this farmland, which had existed in the 18th century in Hingham, these massive tracts of land, are just no longer economically viable. They just don't have the manpower, and many of them don't have the desire anymore to run them as farms. So during this time is when you start to see the John Brewers and the David Wittens and these other guys, Edmund Hersey, Albert Fearing, George Lincoln, purchasing small tracts of land for this gentleman farming type of activity. And this eventually culminates in 1858 in the formation of the New Hingham Agricultural and Horticultural Society, which had existed for a period of time as just the Agricultural Society, but again, during this time period, there's kind of a renewed vigor in wanting to pursue agriculture as a science. The aims of this new society were scientific, economic, social, and educational. They purposefully wanted to leave all politics and religion out of everything that was involved because they weren't coming there to debate the topics of the day. They were coming there to share in their love of nature and their love of planting and those types of subjects. So it wasn't really for discussing the political climate. But also, again, a certain sense of nostalgia was definitely present for simpler times. If you can imagine that in 1858, people wanting for a simpler time. Specific aims of the society included encouraging and improving the science and practice of agriculture and horticulture, and promoting the amelioration of various species of animals, grains, fruit, and vegetables. This sense of nostalgia and kind of rejection of modernity to revitalize the domestic arts, and this is a quote, in these days of public schools and sewing machines. So things were just progressing way too rapidly for these guys, and they said, we got to get back to a time when it was just...
Before sewing machines.
Before sewing machines, when people just were off the rails. So going back to a simpler time. Interestingly enough, though, it's a small period here because these guys, they're older guys. They come back to town after making their money, making their wealth. But the next generation largely isn't interested in that, and they want to go to school and they want to pursue an education and get involved in business, and they end up actually not really adhering to this, And so the Agriculture and Horticultural Society sees its greatest strength towards the end of the 19th century, and it continues into the 20th, but not with the same type of passion that we see again the Brewers and these other guys putting into it. Did you have anything you wanted to add on?
Well,
that,
I'm distracted from what you're saying about the video. What we're seeing here is a pretty large-scale haying operation, and it's pretty phenomenal. If you saw that stack of hay there. Now, an earlier question that Michael had posed to me was, what are signs of farming on the property today? Well, there's the stone walls, there's the open fields, but probably the most genuine connection to what's happened there is the fact that we still use hay fields at World's End. And if you go out there 2 or 3 times a year, you'll see either the guys who work at for the trustees for the season or the year-round employees out on the fields and collecting hay, and that hay still goes and feeds cows either at Ware River Farm up the street from here or at Hornster Farm down in Norwell, Hingham, depending on what where he's keeping them. So Yeah, there's a strong connection to farming on the property still, just in the sense that the trustees maintain the property with the big open fields in a lot of ways for the aesthetic value of that. It's very pleasing, right? But in order to maintain those fields, we have to come up with really more. I guess more complex reasons than just, okay, well, it looks pretty. Well, how can they be purposeful? So is it an ecological reason, like ground nesting bird habitat? Can it tie into a local food stream, like for instance with the haying that can feed cows, that then you get a bottle of milk delivered at your doorstep? So yeah, as I'm seeing that big load of hay go down the cart path, or up the cart path, that to me looks like the Ware River Road. A lot of it still happens today, and this year we're hopeful to get 3 cuts. So, yeah.
Just barely made it in the door there.
Yeah.
So this actually is the Frank Brewer barn, I think, that we're seeing here.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, which I think is an image of out in the display. But to get back to the Brewers, and again, it's they were very much focused on preserving the beauty and comfort of life in Hingham, and that came with a certain aesthetic value, which I think is still valued today. And you see other people at this time, again, taking socially inclined land development and producing it for the good of the population. So you see Melville Gardens being developed at this time, which again was this, for anyone who doesn't know, is a theme park, essentially, a leisure park over on Crow Point. Was never economically sustainable. Prices were kept very low to allow people to come in and enjoy the environment. And so at this time, you're seeing people with this kind of effort to provide places for families to kind of enjoy themselves. Again, industrialization is leading us to a point where people aren't having to work 17, 18 hours a day just to make sure they survive the winter. Right. They have more time on their hands, and they're looking for things to do. And Brewer was willing to welcome them onto his property, welcome them onto World's End. He encouraged it. As long as you were well behaved, that was his big thing. But again, he was very much concerned with preserving the natural elements of Hingham. So when Bradley Fertilizer wanted to expand from their Weymouth side operation onto the Hingham side of the Back River, Brewer stood up and said, absolutely not. And he took a bunch of supporters and made this grandiose claim that every individual has a free heritage in the purity of air, light, and water. So I was saying when I was talking to Pierre, there's a great time with the current compressor station debate here as to, again, preserving the natural beauty and effects of Hingham. And this continues on with Brewer's son. So Frank, in 1880, decides that we need to take this type of preservation activity and take it beyond World's End, take it beyond the properties of the Brewer family, and really bring it to the town itself. And so he suggests the formation of a tree club, which essentially its purpose is to plant trees and to again promote the growth of a natural landscape throughout the town. So very soon after, the new Hingham Tree Association, along with Frank, set out to planting trees. They started on Pear Tree Hill, Cottage Street, moved on to Summer Street, Green Street, North and Lincoln Streets. Again, trying really hard to fill in some of this land, which for years had just been open farmland. Again, trying to bring some trees back into the landscape. And this kind of spread pretty quickly. John Todd, who was the superintendent of the Hingham Cemetery at the time, really wanted to bring the same effects to the cemetery. And again, many of the trees that are planted there in Hingham Cemetery now were planted during this push, during this drive to bring more trees throughout Hingham.
Right. So essentially, what we're starting to see with even the next generation with Frank is the influence of the Brewer family is really starting to spread. Yeah. Eventually, it'll play out at World's End as it becomes a public reservation. But even during their time, so even as Frank Brewer is maturing, he sees this need for civic engagement and bringing his interest, but ultimately something of public good to the townsfolk of Hingham. So the influence is spreading.
Most definitely. And again, everyone knows the Eleanor Roosevelt story where she comes here in 1942 and she remarks that we have the most beautiful Main Street in America. And I'm convinced that a large portion of that is stemming from the fact that Main Street was lined with beautiful elm trees. Right. That they contributed to this sprawling canopy that covered the street, and it must have looked miraculous at the time, which again were later lost to Dutch elm disease. But that's what's contributing to the beauty that Eleanor, I think, is remarking about. And around this time in the 1880s is when John Brewer begins to work with Olmsted to create these tree-lined carriage paths, which really define the landscape of World's End. So Peter, will you speak a little bit to that partnership?
Yeah, and just to be clear, even as Michael and I were preparing for this early in the week, we couldn't help but get away from the fact that the turn of the century is just the best. You have some very creative minds doing some incredible things, and there was this strong sense of not only civic pride and this idea of being a contributing member of society, being a real citizen. But so there's a lot going on, and landscape architecture is growing up out of this time as well. Frederick Law Olmsted is America's first most famous landscape architect. He gets his start with Central Park in New York City with a gentleman by the name of Carl Vaux, and from there he really does move mostly through the country, up into Chicago, D.C., out to Sacramento. All over the place, working in a large civic capacity, designing public landscapes, and then getting into private residential landscapes, getting into things like subdivisions, and Riverside in Illinois is a perfect example of an Olmsted subdivision, not too dissimilar, only on a larger scale from what you'd see at World's End. But to get to this point of think about what Frank Brewer is doing on a small scale in the town of Hingham by going around and saying that that trees are important. They provide a certain sense of social equity. It's important to human health. Or John Brewer, fighting against the expansion of the fertilizer plant. This isn't a good thing for human health. This was at the core of what Olmsted's beliefs were, not only in designing something like Central Park or taking on a subdivision design like what he did at World's End, but in his other work in conservation, in the formation of his report on the Yosemite Valley, which he was instrumental in writing and eventually getting preserved. He stakes the claim that being able to be in nature and what it provides for people is an essential human right. And because it should be an essential human right to take in the value of nature and how it affects us positively from a human health standpoint, it should then thus be something that is provided to us free of charge by the government. So as we're talking about like the start of the national park system, that this is what's at the backbone of it. This is why it should be federal land. It should be provided to the people because it's a core human right, the same way as our Bill of Rights, right? It's a core human right to have this provided to us. So this is what's kind of behind the Olmsted, and I could go on for about 2 hours about it, but we'll get back on track here.
Yeah.
And I should just say, so by the time that Brewer hires Olmsted has had his career kind of in the books, right? He's only about 5 years removed from retirement, so his whole resume is filled out. He is widely known. The fact that he came to Hingham is remarkable. It's not the only Olmsted project in Hingham, but it's obviously the most well-known. With that being said.
Yeah, most definitely. And again, part of this conversation is to talk about the legacy of the Brewer family. And again, it's a legacy of preservation, of conservation, and eventually of philanthropy. And we get into Wilman Brewer, who was the son of Frank, grandson of John, born in 1898, lived on the family estate at Great Hill over off of, we can't think of the street, which is terrible. So the estate was purchased by Catherine Hay Moore in the early 20th century, but she would become Wilman's wife pretty soon after the family purchased the estate. So Wilman grows up on the estate, marries the daughter of the person who purchased the estate, and ends up continuing to live there. So he ends up living there his entire life. He fights as a second lieutenant in the trenches of World War I, returns back to the States, goes to Harvard to earn a master's and a doctorate in English, where he also is a professor, becomes an accomplished professional poet and writer, amateur landscape architect, landscape artist and an amateur naturalist. Again, kind of living the life of an early 20th century aristocrat. He's got money, he's got time, he's got a tremendous amount of education, and he's pursuing the things that interest him. But again, you know, with all of that comes a desire to give back. You know, and when the Historical Society formed in 1914, Wilman Brewer, just 5 years later, in 1919, purchases the Old Ordinary from private ownership, and then donates it to the society in 1922 at a very young age of only 25 years old. So again, this idea of preservation, both natural and historic, is something that the family believed in deeply and wanted to continue through the years. Wilman was also, I have to say, a lifelong supporter of the library. He served as a trustee for an amazing 47 years between 1938 and 1985, which means he would have overseen the closing of the old Hingham Library at Hingham Center, the raising of Agricultural Hall, which was the headquarters of the Agricultural and Horticultural Society, where his grandfather had kind of attended those early meetings, and then the building of this current library. Wilman would have presided over all of that. Again, a testament to his desire to give back to the town that his family cared so deeply about. And then even beyond that, Wilman and Catherine, on their 64th anniversary of their engagement, donate the estate on Great Hill and a total of 300 acres to the town, which would eventually become more Brewer Park. And so again, this continuously giving back to the town and preserving the natural landscape is very important. I think that's the end of the video, so we're going to go back and do a couple sections over again. So then we get to World's End after the Brewers. So Fanny Brewer is the last brewer to own the property, and after her death in 1936, it went through several possibilities over the years. In the 50s and 60s, it faced possible development. For a brief period of time, it was actually a proposed site for the United Nations, which you can't imagine what that would have done to Hingham. And it was also the proposed location of a nuclear power plant. Again, what could have been. In 1967, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council suggested preservation. Again, to think that it took them 30 years to say, hey, what if we preserve the land is remarkable. And the trustees of reservation matched $200,000, which was raised by Samuel Wakeman, and came to an agreement to purchase the property for preservation and care and raise an additional $250,000 over the next 10 years. Peter, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And even just to reflect on what you just brought up. So think about just the impact of the Brewers through the generations, right? First you have, the patriarch, if you want to call him that, John Brewer, and what he's establishing at World's End, and his contribution to this idea of protecting heritage, which is extremely important, especially in a town like Hingham. And then you get to his kids, which, between Frank and the Tree Club, and then the work of Fanny Brewer and continuing to preserve World's End, when it easily could have been developed. They had the plan in hand. And then you get down to this generation that Michael just touched on, where you have Wilman over at Great Hill, and the major contribution he made to the town with that donation, which is now more Brewer Park. And then finally, Helen Brewer Walker, so the other granddaughter, and that's still connected with World's End, who eventually works with the trustees to get that chunk of land preserved. It was a remarkable time for the trustees in 1967, and I touched on this a little bit in our first lecture, and I'll go through it briefly now. But up until that point, most of the land that the trustees had acquired was simply gift, right? And not only was it gifted, but most of the land was gifted with a matching endowment in order so that the lands that were gifted could then have an adequate source of funding to maintain them. Land preservation does come at a cost, right? What had happened prior to the acquisition of World's End, and we had hardly ever purchased a property like that, right? We had just acquired 2 properties out west from a woman by the name of Mabel Choate. She had worked with another very well-known landscape architect, Fletcher Steele, in the development of Nomkeg. If you haven't been out there, that's a fantastic property to visit. Historic home, incredible gardens, iconic blue steps. You really have to visit if you can. But because of her connection with the trustees and the endowment that she left to the trustees, for the first time in the organization's history, we actually had, the ability, if the property seemed worthy enough, to try to take a little bit of a risk and purchase a property. And it was the very next property that came up was 67 World's End. And it was kind of, so there's this perfect storm of, you have this land conservation organization that had a good reputation and wanted to, the landowners wanted to work with the trustees. A relationship with, between the trustees and the Brewers Walkers had actually started all the way back in the 30s. So they wanted to work with us. Now we had the means to do it. And at the same time, there was still, this sense of civic pride in the efforts by the townspeople of Hingham at that time and the townspeople of Cohasset. And then the farther reaching effort to raise the money as well really all came together and crescendoed in 67 to get this place purchased and then preserved forever. So it really was quite an effort enough to put together a lecture series 50 years later. So
yeah, definitely. And so again, it's it's this idea of a legacy of what the Brewers started in the mid 19th century, carried over into the mid 20th. And you can see other examples of it. In the mid 1970s, Bear Cove Park was under
right.
some debate. And the Bear Cove Park Committee came together to make sure that was preserved as conservation land. Wampatuck State Park, again, 1966, so right around the same time as the World's End acquisition. Mason Foley led efforts to save the Naval Ammunition Depot Annex at Wampatuck. And prevent further development of that area. And I just found out that I guess it was another proposed site for the Space Center for the Apollo missions.
Oh.
So again, what could have been Wampatuck shooting rockets into space. But then other examples of preservation around town. You've got Trip Hammer Pond, you've got Turkey Hill, you've got all these great spaces, some of which are maintained by the trustees. Again, as part of the storied history of trying to preserve green spaces in Hingham, as part of what makes the town special.
Yeah, you have listed there Ware River Farm. I mean, Ware River Farm has only been a trustee's property since, I believe, about 1999. Again, this was actually a property that falls into this mode of a gentleman's farm, right? It's a country estate. It's not too dissimilar from what Brewer was establishing for himself at World's End. As the trustees moved through successive decades, we noticed that the agricultural heritage in Massachusetts was starting to disappear. And the director at that time said, there should be an effort made towards preserving this somehow. Is there farmland? Is there agricultural land that we can actually work to save? The same way we've worked to save tracts of woodlands, the same way we've worked to preserve coasts and historic homes, that agricultural land fits right into the mission of what the trustees are trying to do. And so Ware River Farm is a great example in Hingham, and it's a great opportunity. Where else can you get into a town as developed as Hingham and find 80 acres of open space that actually still maintains livestock? It's a remarkable thing to see. Head up Turkey Hill Lane and say hi to the Belted Galloways. It really is pretty remarkable. So yeah.
And again, a tie into this kind of contemporary, to your point, this kind of contemporary efforts to do the same thing.
Right.
That's what's always existed here. So, so that kind of wraps up the lecture. We've got a few materials out over here that we'd love to encourage you to take a look at. Some historic and archival material from the Historical Society and also the collections here at the library. But we'd also love to take any questions. So, yeah.
When they cut the hay, is there any announcement of it, like in the newspapers or anything like that, anywhere around?
No, so a couple of things on that, and I should have mentioned it as we were even watching some of this footage. Hay production is a fickle operation. You have to time it just right so that it didn't rain prior, and it's not going to rain afterwards, and otherwise the hay spoils, and it's good for almost nothing. And then between that and having just enough staff to actually get the work done, to try to actually make it into something. Hey, by the way, we're going to go out and hay. That could pose a little bit challenging. But yes, there's been times, and I sit right next to our stewardship manager who schedules the haying operation, and he'll plan it one week, and then we'll have to say we can't do it today. Sorry, it's we see a storm coming in, and it may not even rain, and then we say, well, I guess we could have done it, but so it can be a little fickle. Yeah. Further on back.
Hi, Peter.
Hey.
Is there availability of these if we want to purchase them or whatever?
The footage.
Yeah.
So I'll let Michael answer that. Yeah,
it is not available for sale. This is the only copy that we found in the collection. Again, it was on a disc. I'm still trying to figure out where it came from, because I was shocked. I mean,
what was the box labeled?
Yeah, the box was just a box of things that was just labeled "stuff to do," and so I said, well, that's a good place as any to start. So I opened it up, and just to give you the background, I've only been here at the library for a little over a year, working through some of their collections, and so I figured that was again a good place to start.
Sure.
And the disc wasn't labeled, and so I put it into the computer and discovered this, and was just really blown away. And I was excited to show it to Matt over here and to Peter when they came to talk about this project with Linda, the director, and myself. So yeah, I'm still trying to get to the bottom of where exactly it came from, but it is not available for sale.
Well, I think it's worthwhile, though, in the future, looking to place that out.
Put it on the historical site or
Because this is
something.
very, the more people have it, the more you're spreading the word.
Most definitely, and again, the ultimate goal is to put a lot of the collections here at the library up online, and this would be one of the first things I think we would try and get up there, because again, it is captivating, and at the same time, we don't know who many of these people are, and we would love to see if there was anyone out there who did know, who could name some of these farmhands and some of these other people working the fields. If they had any sort of background or context, it would be very helpful. So to your point, it's important to get it out there.
Yeah, sure, in front.
Any of the original buildings still there? Any of the homes, any of the barns? Is there any of those still?
So the long and short of it is no, but that doesn't mean that you still can't see evidence of some structures. Okay, out at World's End itself, the foundation of the sheepfolds can still be seen. That's pretty widely known. It's on the the trail map we provide for visitors. As far as Brewer's estate, his homestead that would have been up on Martin's Lane, that all started to really fade pretty quickly, especially after Fanny Brewer passed away. So at that point, all the livestock is sold off. Buildings are being raised. The barn, there was an original barn. I think it burned in 1928, and there was a structure that was rebuilt. But now there are some dated homes along Martin's Lane, but they're not tied to the Brewer family. Now there's remnants, especially things that wouldn't be wood. So stone walls that are left from the Brewer estate, columns that would have marked the entrance to his property, and there's evidence. There's subtle evidence of operations out on the property itself. For instance, there's a tract of woodland that if you get out onto the property in the wintertime, you'll notice that where there should be a hill, there's actually a little bit of a flat space. And if you take a look at where that flat space is and you compare that to some historical records, you realize that was probably the location of where the old Thaxter barn was, a structure that was out at World's End that was long ago raised. So there's evidence, but no. The long and short of it's no.
Didn't you say there's a section that is a tree farm that was laid out by Frank?
Yeah, Frank was obsessed with trees. There's no other way to put it. Olmsted recommended he plant a single row of trees along every cart path. He planted a double row. He between his work in the cemeteries and on the streets of Hingham. And not only so much that, but it's dated in Frank's diary and in Caroline's diary. Caroline is the wife of John Brewer. That planting out at World's End actually began in 1880, and the commission with Olmsted didn't begin until at least 4 years later, and the design is finally drawn up in 1890. So trees were actually already started being planted out at World's End as much as a decade before the plan is finally finished. And there's evidence out there that's very clear of what would have been one of Frank Brewer's old tree nurseries. He was, not only did they have a greenhouse where they could start trees very quickly, but he also set out in multiple areas, not just at World's End, but in the World's End neighborhood, small nurseries where he grew up trees to a certain size before sending them out to be planted. So if you're walking, down the path towards the bar, not up to the top of Planters Hill, but the path that skirts the contour and then finally down to the bar. And you look out towards the water in the direction of the Boston skyline. Off to the left, you'll notice trees that seem scattered, but if you look at them at the right angle, they're actually all in a straight line. And then if you look between some of the trees, you'll see in the ground there's depressions in the earth. And those depressions are the dug holes from trees that were taken out of what was a old Frank Brewer nursery. So, yeah.
Other questions?
When Eleanor Roosevelt made that famous comment about Hingham, do you know that, did she meet this family, the Brewers? Do you know anything about what she was doing in Hingham?
Well, she was coming to Hingham on a visit, a tour of the country, essentially, and she was coming around to various towns. But I don't believe she met the Brewers. This would have been, 6 years after Fanny Brewer passed away, and to Peter's point, they had sold off all the livestock. They had gotten away from World's End, so the Brewers, had kind of gotten away. She may very well have met Wilman Brewer, who again was over at Great Hill, but it's tough to say specifically. I'm not sure.
Any other questions? Yeah, right in front. Yeah.
Any evidence of Native American occupancy on World's End?
Yeah, I think that if you were a professional archaeologist, you would say absolutely sure. To the naked eye, no. We do know that Native Americans passed through, but only in a kind of a light touch fashion. So never permanent settlement. Summer camps, yes, very similar to how it would have been on the Boston Harbor Islands, but never permanent settlements.
The Cow Rock.
Yeah. Oh, you guys didn't come to our last lecture, did you? Yeah. We don't know what the story with that is. It's certainly a World's End anomaly, kind of a curiosity. As I mentioned in the last lecture, it's a CAL with dots between the letters. It'd be fun to think that the L stood for Lincoln. They're pretty well known in the town of Hingham, but we're not particularly sure. It has a date on it, which is great, and
we have to go on.
We have some initials, but for now it's still a mystery. Yeah. So yeah. Like Michael mentioned, on the table up front beneath the white veil, there's some fantastic material. I highly recommend before you leave, take a good look at it. Yeah, sure. And we'll be up here too to answer any further questions. So with that, we encourage you to take a look, and thanks again for joining us. It was a fun lecture series.